me.
Great. So, good afternoon, everyone. Hope all of you are doing well. So now we are towards the end game, so to speak, right, of the course. And somehow, the sort of quick update, PGP office had I think someone missed the notice about the second quiz, which I requested them to organize. So possibly tomorrow, day after tomorrow, at their convenience, they would conduct a quiz. But anyway, all of you know it for a long time, right? Second quiz, clear inventory, the entirety of inventory, and third quiz, which will happen a bit later, which would be the syllabus would be supply chain contracts as well as supply chain integration, push, pull, postponement, and all those things that we talked about, right? So that will be for the third quiz. So as you remember, we'll take the best two out of three and make do with that, right? Now, last time, if you remember, we were talking of different models, right? Especially we were focusing on retail, and we talked about players like Aldi, if you remember, right? We talked about Aldi, we talked about Costco, right? We talked about, for example, we talked about a little bit about Amazon, the role of technology, Walmart, right? We talked about Alibaba. We also try to link it back to what Reliance, for example, is trying to do, what DMart is trying to do, and stuff like that, right? So that was a broad coverage. And within that context, I had made an argument that, of course, for everyone, procurement is important, obviously, but perhaps much more importantly, right? Much more importantly, for categories like grocery, procurement becomes all the more important. And if you remember, the logic was whenever dealing with very low margin, right? For an equivalent increase in profits, for with low margins, the increase in sales is humongous. So which becomes very, very difficult for any company anywhere in the world, not just in India, right? So that is why you find many of these players are ultra focused on ensuring optimization in their procurement operations. Like a lot of time, money, effort gets spent there. And in the same context, we talked about purchasing being such a crucial function for players both in India as well as abroad. So today we want to build on that, right? We'll try to also align our discussions on the case, if you remember, RFID at Metro, right? So we'll take that up for a quick discussion. Of course, it's a very descriptive case. I mean, there are one or two strategic questions. Operationally, it's a very detailed description. There is there's no lot of calculations involved, right? In fact, the case itself automatically gives you a lot of data crunching is already done in the case, right? So in that sense, we'll take up that case also. I'll highlight 2-3 important points worth highlighting. We'll also talk about different outsourcing paradigms, right? Different frameworks. For example, Kraljick's portfolio matrix. We'll talk about issues related to, for example, what Toyota was known for historically, right? And we will also try to talk a little bit about, for example, Zara's operations. And post that, time permitting, we'll try to talk a little bit about supply chain risk management also. So we have, see, I hope you realize, we have from very dedicated modules, right? Inventory, logistics, network design, contracts. We are now coming more and more towards integration. And remember, a lot of integration conceptually it will not be new, but the way you link different concepts, right? So for example, even if you're talking of risk management, does inventory not play a role? Of course, it plays a role, right? So remember, there are a lot of reading materials which are there in your Moodle, right? So all of those are part of the course. So depending on the module, please go through all of those things, right? Or please go through all of those things, right? So especially, for example, we talked a little bit about technology last time. We talked a little bit about technology this time. So for example, and this is more of a take-home thing, and in some sense, I'm already telling you about the exam. So will definitely be a question around blockchain and IoT in supply chain. Right? Exactly what, I honestly don't know. I've not thought about it, but it will be fairly generic so that anybody who has spent some time studying both of these things should be able to crack it, right? But definitely do take this as a background reading and do that. And definitely one question will be around, if not directly, at least indirectly around this theme, right? So blockchain and IoT, try to read as much as possible. Don't have to go into the very, very, very depths of it, right? But definitely a broad understanding of what is happening the world over, problems, challenges, key areas of concern, right? So that is pretty much it. So last time, and on the session before that, we were talking a lot about technology. We talked about Asian Paints. We talked about, for example, Benetton. We talked about, Pepperfry. We talked about postponement. We talked about a lot, if you remember, right? Especially integration and all those things. So I thought I'll just begin with, with one example of where the company tried to do parallel processing, tried to think of postponement, and tried to bring technology in the supply chain, but it failed. Not very similar from what I told you last time, right? Walmart's shelf scanning robots. They are being stopped now. They're being stopped now. So I'll show you a classic example of another company which failed to do that. By the way, initially when this company burst onto the scene, right, they made a huge splash. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, I'm always a bit jittery with numbers in terms of remembering numbers. SoftBank, invested quite a few. I think net of net, it was $375 million. Is what the figure that we people were talking about. So this shut down a few months back, right? In terms of its core operations, they are pivoting, as they say. So let me show you the product, right? And then we'll talk a little bit more on that. So basically, an example of when it did not pay off the way you thought it would pay off, right? So just give me a second, I'll pull it up. It's made a huge splash, when it burst onto the scene.
We're here at Zoom Pizza, where they make pizza with robots. We're gonna see how they do it, but first, let's order a pie.
At Zoom, humans and robots work together to make pizza, and you can see it happening from start to finish. The first step in the process is that the pizza is put onto the line. We use optical targeting and a pretty sophisticated vision system to tell each robot when to trigger. So your pizza has tomato sauce on it. That means Pepe, our tomato sauce dispensing robot, knows when the optical target reaches its laser to dispense the exact perfect amount of sauce, which he did just now. The next step is that sauce needs to get spread. So Marta, our sauce spreading robot, will take that sauce and spread it into a spiral. The next step in the process is done by humans. Noel is one of our amazing pizzaiolos. He's gonna take that pizza, adjust any imperfections, and then actually begin to add cheese and toppings. The humans have 22 seconds to complete the topping step before Bruno, the next robot, takes the pizza off of the line and puts it into the par bake oven. Bruno is a very powerful robot. He's a 6-axis robot. You've seen this kind of a robot mostly in manufacturing settings. We're using this robot to make pizza. So that means we need to fine-tune this robot so that it can actually mimic what a human would do with a similar tool. This is a totally compostable sugarcane-based box that's designed to keep pizza incredibly delicious because all of these ridges keep the pizza from getting soggy. So your pizza's ready.
Oh, looks so good.
So Georgia, Marta, Pepe, Bruno, the pizza-making robots that you saw today, allow us to reduce the amount of time for each individual pizza preparation step. They allow us to reduce the error rate because robots are designed to make the same motion consistently and perfectly. And they also allow us to invest more of our resources in high-quality ingredients as opposed to repetitive manual labor steps.
Tell me a little bit about some of the other ways that you guys have been innovating, especially in how the consumer interacts with the brand.
We want people to be able to get the highest quality food in about half the time. Our average delivery right now is 22 minutes. And that's 22 minutes from the second that you place the order on your phone or computer to the time it actually arrives at your door. So your pizza's never sitting around. And we have this team of pilots that are tied into a logistics and routing program that allows them to optimize their routes and minimize the amount of time that it takes to drive to your door.
You guys are already using robots, but what's next?
The next most important step for us is what we call baking on the way. In the center of it is our hub, our home facility here, and then each node is an individual delivery vehicle. Those delivery vehicles have 56 proprietary mobile ovens that are wired to actually cook pizza while it's being delivered. And Zoom owns the patent for this technology, which we call cooking en route, or better known as baking on the way.
And so right now it's just pizzas, but am I gonna be able to get like beef bourguignon someday via robots?
Right now we're hyper-focused on giving you the highest quality pizza that we possibly can, and so that means we have to be laser-focused. But it's a big, wide world, and there's certainly additional opportunities to innovate beyond pizza.
Right. So, see, I'm sure many of you would have been able to identify the elements of postponement, right? What they're trying to do here in terms of their truck. In fact, legend has it that the founder of the company, right? I forgot his name. Not this one, right? So apparently, when he scored a meeting with Masayoshi Son, what he does is he takes the Zoom truck, right? He rides into his driveway with the truck, prepares a pizza for him, and walks away with $375 million, in terms of what his company is looking for, right? So I mean, no talk of business models, no talk of process design, no talk of cost issues, revenue maximization. No, he rolls in with an automated truck, makes a pizza, walks away with hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of valuation. Right? I mean, this is, by the way, from Bloomberg Business Week story, which came out a few months back, right? So that way, SoftBank was a bit weird at times, right? But it is what it is, right? Because you never know when things bounce back. There's always an element of luck which people tend to downplay. So right now, if you look at what many of the analysts are saying, that WeWork seems to be doing quite well, and as a medium to long-term bet, it seems to be a pretty good bet. So that's what people are saying now. But remember, WeWork, maybe a year or two back, right? Initially, when it was about to be listed, some of the most storied names in finance, the biggest of financial institutions, and I kid you not, this is real documented, right? They were touting a valuation of $50 to $100 billion. Correct. It was not doing, but now it's doing all right. Now it's doing all right after the reorganization. So these players were touting a valuation of $50 to $110 billion. Now this is too wild an estimate, right? 50 to 60 you can understand, maybe 50 to 70 you can possibly digest, but 50, it was not even 50, it was less than 50 to $110 billion is what they were promising. So you are worth this much. And of course, we all know the reality. Listing never really happened in that sense, right? So the point is, a lot of times these operational issues, people don't understand. So it could be all about process design. See, it's important to understand, right? We have this Zoom Pizza company, in which the automation is failing, the robotic involvement is failing, for example. For Walmart also, in a part of the operations, these are failing. It's a lot of it, again, studies need to be done to be able to make a more definitive statement, but most definitely, the classic way to evaluate these options. Remember, the classic way to evaluate these options could be that what is the incremental cost and what is the incremental benefit, right? And on balance, you can take a call, right? So that is true. But remember, most of the operations that they are trying to bring, where they're trying to bring robotization, etc. The problem is, again, I'm not sure. This could be post facto, right? With hindsight, everybody's a genius, right? So, but many of the processes that you are looking for may not necessarily have been that value accretive. That value may not be generated by bringing in for a higher degree of robot involvement, right? So that's at least that's the realization which Walmart got. Shelf scanning again and again and again, somehow they did not get the same benefit which they had thought they would do. So in that sense, a lot of these changes happen, right? A lot of this technology gets adopted. But like most cases, as we'll see shortly for Metro also after some time, very often, right, the people who are at the forefront of trying to identify new technology, trying to identify new cases, they don't necessarily reap the benefits. Why so? Because it takes some time to understand the model. And by the time you have understood the model, somebody else has come in and used your learnings and perfected their own model. So that is why what I'm trying to highlight is, of course, many of these companies, whether it's about inventory, whether it's about design, whether it's about automation, whether it's about industry 4.0, whatever, right? Many of them do amazing job, but obviously there's at times an element of luck also. There is obviously an element of luck, right? I mean, otherwise, see, there are weird stories, right? I mean, I'll share with you one small story. There was a company called Juicero. I don't know how many of you read about it. If not, maybe in the last 5 years or so, one of the weirdest tales of a company, right? I mean, you also had Theranos and others, etc. So that was a different level of cynicism altogether. Juicero is the weirdest of this all. So Juicero, apparently, part of the story was that we are going to give you the best of the best, right? The best of the best, right? Juice packets, right away, right? Absolutely. I think you might remember, right? We heard a story, right? So the point is, we'll give you the best of the best, and there is a very sophisticated look, not sophisticated, but definitely an elegant looking contraption which they made, right? And you would have juice packets, and the machine would do some sort of ultra compression, and the best of the best juice will come. So in that sense, no, we are giving you the best of Mother Nature. No, you should pay us their best also. So it created them just like this company. It again created a bit of splash, right? And it was really flying high until one fine day. And if I'm not mistaken, it was again Bloomberg Business Week which had a small article, and they did a very small study. And I kid you not, this is well documented, right? So they did a small study. And, they took those same packets, right, raw material packets, and the reporter involved just crushed it by hand. Right? I mean, that's not as if, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger or the world's strongest man or somebody, doing that. No, no, no. A normal reporter took those packets, crushed it by hand, got precisely the same juice. I kid you not, almost the stroke of that article, by the time the article became well known, by the end of the day, the company was almost gone. Because people are saying, you have been taking us for idiots. Is that so? Right? I mean, it was at one point of time really big. Really, I mean, I say really big in terms of the sort of the aura that they were able to create, right? But it took a single article, and oh, this is the one. Huh? Thanks for sharing. So what I'm trying to highlight is inventory, product design, logistics network. All of these have an important role to play, right? And whether it's about procurement, whether it's outsourcing, or things like that, all of these things matter. In fact, some of you from first year might remember, right? GE, that most storied of firms, right? Arguably one of those titans of industry, without any exaggeration, which have made the modern world the way it is, right? Some of you might remember that classic bulb thing which I showed you, right? First year, especially I think BMD. I don't remember whether I showed it in OM or not, but BMD me that when we're talking, OM also, I think when we're talking product quality, bulb on, off. I remember that was G. And if you remember, I told you I don't want you to kill me. So I want to show you the entire mechanism. I don't want you to kill me. So the best of the companies falter, right? Having said that, that benefit and cost, right? That balance has to be there, right? But there is a small problem. Okay, I'll just highlight the problem and quickly come back. See, Clayton Christensen, right? Arguably the greatest management thinker in the last 3-4 decades or so, right? Of course, innovator's dilemma, innovator solution, etc., etc. He did a lot of work, but more importantly, in the context of the current discussion, he made a very strong and a very famous statement that tools, financial tools, right? Financial tools like, for example, NPV, right, net present value, are actually innovation killers. And of course, this is Clayton Christensen saying this, not me, right? And his argument was the following. So, for example, when you talk of NPV, for example, right? Now, NPV, basically, it's about net present value, net, right? So, inflows, outflows, net value, right? So, net present value, right? So, his argument was, see, whenever you are talking of, right? So, if you look at the nature of innovation, right? So, we are talking of innovations, automations, etc., right? Just to quickly answer that question. So in the context of automation, etc., right? So we had examples where it became very successful so far. For example, Kiva robots. We talked about Alibaba, right? We also talked about the other innovations. So we had the Walmart Tower, right? But we also had some examples which failed, right? Technology in operations and supply chain, right? So yes, last time around we had these self-scanning robots. This time we had this Zoom, which was also using robots. So the problem is, how do you decide in your operations and supply chain, should you go ahead with this technology enabled solution or not, right? So in that domain, Clayton Christensen had a very interesting point. His point was, if you focus very myopically on financial metrics, for example, NPV, which is arguably one of the more important metrics out there in the world of management, right? His argument was tools like NPV, right, are actually innovation killers. And his argument was relatively straightforward, right? And it finds a lot of resonance, by the way. His point was, in NPV, basically you are looking for inflows, outflows, right? Net present, net present value, right? Discounted to the present value, right? So his argument was, see, by definition, if it's a potentially groundbreaking innovation, right? If it is something which is very, very basic, the problem is you won't even know the cost. It will take time for it to realize, right? And even if you were to somehow get to know the cost, the problem is, by its very nature, such an innovation can have a very, very, very diverse set of applications. We saw the same technology being used in a warehouse, in a micro fulfillment center by Ocado, and in a restaurant by Alibaba. Same technology, right? So in that sense, even the revenue projections are questionable. So when you say that I will decide on the basis of NPV, I mean, you don't even know what the NPV is, neither the cost part nor the revenue part. None of it is known. So how can you very myopically take a call just based on a single number, right? So I mean that's where that whole idea which we talk about in statistics and operations, right? That point estimates. So when the estimates are highly uncertain, right? I mean, some of you might remember, right? I forgot the name. What was the name? Move for something. That dog walking app. I kid you not, right? Dog walking app, which was worth $300 million. Dog walking app, right? $300 million. I'm very bad at remembering the full details, so feel free to check it out, right? Again, of course, the usual culprit, SoftBank, also involved here also, right? But it is what it is. But coming back to the point, my point is when you use point estimates, right? When you use point estimates, that end of the day, I'm looking for this value, right? Or this is my rate of return. The problem is a lot of it is based on assumptions. So that is why rather than having point estimates, it's always better to have, I keep on advocating what if analysis, right? What if analysis. So that is where the utility of what if analysis comes, that you check how robust your predictions are, right? Otherwise, it's just a guess. You might be covered in a lot of numerical mumbo jumbo, but it's nothing more than a guess. It is absolutely nothing more than a guess, right? So that is why one has to be very, very careful in terms of drawing those kind of predictions, right? So that was the context which I thought we'll begin with. We'll again come back to this whole point of Clayton Christensen when we talk of true. But remember, 50 to 110, right? This is a game of. In case anybody's interested in finance, right? I'm sure many of you might have heard of somebody called Bill Gurley, right? Or or perhaps valuation, etc. I mean, Damodaran to anyway there, but. Yeah, right. So there's another name, somebody by the name of Michael Mauboussin, right? Many people consider Mauboussin to be one of the most influential thinkers, practically speaking. I mean, academically, theoretically, but in the world of practice, Michael Mauboussin has a special place, and I agree. I mean, I've not read all of his work, but whatever I have read, I have always been impressed, right? So, of course, I agree that going for a range will give you that valuation, but many times the problem was that has to be a bit realistic, right? I mean, I'll give you one example, right? So, for example, if you tell me that, let's take the example of the dog walking app, right? In terms of projections, you would draw that, okay, for example, number of families having dogs, average number of dogs per family, average spend per dog, and you are willing to be able to capture this scenario, right? So being able to capture 80% of that might be highly unrealistic, right? The overall spend, right? Because there are health expenses, there are living expenses, there are food expenses, etc. So if you try to claim 80%, that is what this, right? This is too big a number, is what my only worry was. That it's too big a variation. Because see, otherwise you might end up with the whole number line, right? Adi se ant. It becomes a philosophical discussion otherwise, right? So now the point is, what I was saying was, Bill Gurley, for example, is a big fan of something called direct listing, right? And this is something which is becoming very, very pronounced, right? If you look at the world of IPOs, listings, equity raising, etc., direct listings are becoming more and more prominent, right? And there's a growing movement that we don't really need the IPO underwriters, etc. You can list directly, and quite a few of the prominent companies are discussing direct listing, right? So anyway, that's more of a financial issue, not necessarily in supply chain part, right? So we are, as I was saying, we'll try to come back to Metro in just a short while. Allow me to just quickly jump onto the discussion on procurement and outsourcing, right? Now, we talked a lot about outsourcing, we talked a lot about procurement, right? So if you remember, we have talked about Apple's supply chain earlier also, right? How do they atomize the supply chain? Atomize the supply chain. So they do not allow any of these suppliers to be irreplaceable, right? Irreplaceable, right? They don't allow any of the suppliers to be replaceable. So, and of course, then there are a lot of other issues that, the way they see, so Apple has some of the most interesting contracts in the world, as I mentioned earlier, right? They tell their suppliers that we will give you, we'll buy the, I mean, by the way, this is pretty standard. It's not as if only Apple does it, but we will buy the machinery, right, for you. So in that sense, the dependence becomes higher, because if you don't know, we can always kick you out. We can always kick you out, right? So that's most definitely there, yes, but outsourcing, I'm sure many of you would have covered, you have got this topic covered in 100 different places, right? Strategy also, a lot of other code. I'm not going to talk about the reasons for outsourcing, right? That all of you are well familiar. I would talk about frameworks to understand supply as well as outsourcing decisions, right? So the first framework that I want to talk about is from the world of Toyota. Arguably, historically speaking, one of the all-time great supply chains in the world, one of the all-time great supply chains in the world, right? So Toyota had this classic framework wherein what they would ask is they would ask questions on two dependencies, right? So what do they depend on their suppliers on, or dependencies, right? And what are the dependencies? Dependency on knowledge and capacity. So basically they would ask the question that do we know how to make it, whatever be the component, right? Or we don't know. So if you don't know, then in that sense that dependency is because of knowledge. And another kind of dependency could be that I possibly know how to make it, but I may not necessarily have sufficient capacity available with me. I may not necessarily have sufficient capacity available with me, which kind of allows me to make sufficient quantity. So is the dependency because of knowledge or is it because of quantity, right? Quantity slash capacity, right? So that was from a internal point of view. Then there was another question which they would ask, it was from the product architecture point of view. Is the product modular, right? Is the product modular or is it integral? So modular would be something, as we have been saying again and again, which could be broken down into various components, right? Various components. Now, that would be modular, right? Integral. See, what would integral be? Integral would be when the entire product has to be built, manufactured, assembled in one go altogether, right? So many of the, for example, molding operations, the products are, for at times integral, right? It's not modular. So what Toyota would say is that in general, dependency on knowledge is much more problematic than dependency on capacity, number one. And from the product architecture point of view, outsourcing a modular product is easier, right? But outsourcing an integrated product is trickier, right? For obvious reasons, modular means you can break it down into sub-modules, sub-assemblies, give it to different players without becoming overly dependent on them, right? So as a general thumb rule, dependency on knowledge is much more troubling as compared to dependency on capacity. And modular products, it's easier to outsource as compared to integral products. So net of net, what they would say is if a product is modular, right? And we are only dependent on capacity issues. And by the way, the product is not really technical. Then as per their philosophy, outsourcing is actually a very, very, very good opportunity because it would allow them to leverage the economies of scale and scope of the supplier and get items of decent quality at a lower cost. So in that sense, in their argument, outsourcing becomes a very useful opportunity for modular products without dependency of knowledge. I mean, some of you might be a bit feeling that, okay, what is this dependency on knowledge? I'll just give you a small example, right? Even today, many of the Indian players, right, in the automotive space, they have become quite adept in terms of assembly, in terms of localization of supply chain. But even today, parts like engines, for example, right? Engines, there are still, they still have a dependency on knowledge, and all kind of players are involved, right? So some of the Italian design boutique, design boutiques, right? They have an involvement in the engine design, right? And they try to help out players in terms of dependency of knowledge, right? So it's not a dependency on capacity; it's a dependency on knowledge. It's a dependency on knowledge, right? So Toyota also used to do the same thing, right? Many of us would have been reading about electric vehicles and Tesla and what GM is trying to do, what Ford is trying to do, what Hyundai is trying to do with Apple. That was a big news recently, right? Apple and Hyundai tried, teaming up. Did anybody try to find out? I mean, of course, nobody really exactly confirmed that, right? In so many words. But any idea why, of all the possible companies, Apple would go with Hyundai? I mean, there are always pros and cons. But did anybody find any argument in favor of that at least, why I'm saying this question is important to understand is, first of all, there is no answer because it was not acknowledged, no justification was given. But purely as a scholar, right, I think it's useful to have hypotheses, working hypotheses, right? Because Hyundai would possibly not be the first name which comes to your mind when I say which company should Apple partner with, right? And of course, that might be a bit of a generalization on my part. Any and all companies, you never thought Samsung would, turn out the way it did. By the way, Samsung's, presumptive heir, right? He has been, given I think 2.5 years jail. That was the news. I mean, could not read it, but I just saw a flash, if I'm not mistaken, right? So this is again, okay. Having said that, Samsung runs on its managers, not necessarily the major shareholder, but yeah. So the point is, dependency on knowledge could also be there. Dependency on capacity could also be there, right? So if, for example, there is only dependency on capacity, that is basically when you try to leverage outsourcing, right? And in Toyota's philosophy. And remember, Toyota, it's not the be all and end all, right? Toyota has a very sophisticated network in place. What do I mean network? So Toyota electric vehicles, they're trying to do, in fact, Toyota is right now on a bit of a, I won't say the word warpath because that's not how the Japanese businesses roll, but definitely a bit of a tiff with the Japanese government, right? Because see, a lot of businesses like this, right? Japanese government has mandated that beyond this point, electric vehicles will not work. Sorry, IC engine based vehicles will, pure IC engine vehicles will not allow. And Toyota has a problem with the timeline, not necessarily with the statement, but maybe the projection, right? The projection of how we want to be able to do that, right? So they are into a lot, now a bit of a tiff with the government. And imagine, this generally does not happen in the Japanese way of working, right? The tiff with governments. So now the point becomes that how quickly they want to be able to do. Now Toyota had a dependency on knowledge earlier, right? Dependency on knowledge. Nikkei, I told you, right? Nikkei Asian Review, right? Which now owns FT. The Nikkei actually now owns FT Financial Times. So they did a tear down, and by their own admission, Toyota is roughly 3 years behind Tesla. 3 years behind Tesla in terms of the overall EV setup, right? By their own admission, right? Now the point is, Toyota is trying to develop. So there is a dependency on knowledge. Same thing is happening in the EV space. Many of the electric vehicle players, initially at least, they are not able to crack the battery. So that is why you have players like, for example, Panasonic. I'm sure many of you would read about that, right? Panasonic trying to elbow into that space because there is a big dependency on knowledge as well as capacity as an associated value. But now, for example, if like Tesla, what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring that in-house. See, it's fundamentally always about dependency. If you have to have one lens in your supply chain, it's the lens of irreplaceability. See, who makes the lowest margin in the supply chain? Anybody who's replaceable. Anybody who's replaceable would always make low margins. Anybody who's irreplaceable, you do what you want to do, right? So same thing is happening. Players do not want their suppliers to become mega giants, right? They want to be able to control them. And because they want to be able to control them, what they're trying to do is essentially, somebody like Tesla is trying to bring battery in-house, right? So what I was talking about Toyota, for example, was that Toyota has a very sophisticated way of doing this. So if they have a dependency on a knowledge, so within this constellation, right, within the constellation of Toyota suppliers, equity holdings are very common. So it could be 5%, 10%, etc. But in some senses, it boxes the supplier in. It boxes the supplier in. Now you have become a Toyota supplier. You will get volume, but at the same time, right? I mean, basically they try to reduce the dependency by sucking the supplier into their ecosystem. And they have this whole network of system, entities being put together, which has a very obviously different name, but different ways of working, right? So Keiretsu in Japan, Japan, Chaebol in South Korea, and stuff like that, right? Now the point is, okay, why we are dealing with all of this? This is not something which is unique from outsourcing at Toyota, by the way. This happens in the tech space, B2B, B2C, O2O, whatever acronym you want to use, it happens, right? So for example, if you look at the Chinese ecosystem, the two big constellations right now are obviously Alibaba and Tencent. If you look at the Indian ecosystem, I'm sure many of you would have been reading, right? It's Reliance and who is trying to create that other constellation basically. I mean, trying to, I'm saying the reason I'm saying trying to is because Reliance is pretty far ahead. Right. Tata, all of you are correct, right? So Tata is the one which is starting a bit behind. But I would say in many senses, many of the building blocks are already with Tata, if it makes sense. I mean, it is behind, but it may catch up faster. Okay, let me put it like that. Potentially, again, if you read the CEO's interviews, that's kind of what he's alluding to. But in terms of integration, they're starting from a fair bit behind, right? But in some senses, they already have many of the ingredients in place, right? So Reliance and Tata, it's going to be an epic battle potentially. Potentially, of course. Our market is so huge that no, not just two, we can have four also. That's not a problem. But the point is, these constellations are emerging, right? They own what they own, right? They outsource what they want to. So a lot of interesting supply as well as outsourcing games are going to happen in the Indian market also, right? So one has to be careful what to outsource, what not to outsource, right? And how do you increase your irreplaceability in the ecosystem, right? How do you increase your irreplaceability in the ecosystem? So all these things are happening as we speak, right? Are happening as we speak. So this is a very famous framework from Toyota about outsourcing, right? Linking product architecture to dependencies. Is it because of knowledge or capacity, right? So that's part one. That's part one. Now, let me also talk a little bit about spending, right? Let me talk a little bit about spending. In terms of spending, allow me to talk about, a little bit about how do you spend it all together, right? So this framework that you have is a very old framework, decades old framework, but even in 2021, it finds many takers. It finds many takers. I'll show you a couple of examples just now, right? So what Kralzik proposed long time back was an interplay of two very critical factors, and this will have a risk management implication also. I'll just come to risk management possibly in the second half, right? So there's an element of profit impact, and there's an element called supply risk, right? So what is this profit impact basically? Basically, this profit impact, simply put, is the idea that if you start facing problems with this item, right? Is it, for example, a key part of your ingredients, right? Is it a key part of a bill of materials, right? So because can it have an oversized impact, right? Or not so? So low to high, it could range. Supply risk could be governed by multiple factors. How many suppliers are available? Is the technology sophistication? Is there a capacity crunch, right? So any number of reasons. I mean, the technology could be very mundane. There could be multiple suppliers, but there might be a capacity crunch. Item would become, suppliers would be high, right?
If
Yes,
you
please.
could explain the profit impact once more.
Sure. I'll do that. See, fundamentally, as I said, right, it's a very old metrics, right? But even today, it continues to inform decision making, right? So the two factors involved here are profit impact and supply risk. So, try to understand something like this, that imagine you are trying to make, let's say, a mobile phone, right? You're into mobile phone assembly. Camera versus glue, which is used to put the items in place, right? I hope many of you would agree that camera is actually having an outsized impact potentially on the profits compared to glue. Glue is something much more mundane, much more usual. It's not as if it's glue which is to be used in some extreme environment. No, this is industrial glue which is available across mobile phone manufacturers, right? So in that sense, you try to understand that does the underlying component. Remember, we are talking of supply. So supply would be about components, could be about raw materials, could be about sub assemblies, right? So do any of these things have an outsized impact on my product? So that is captured in profit impact. Profit impact, right? So that will be profit impact. Supply risk, as I mentioned, depends on number of factors, including number of suppliers, right? Obviously, if there is only, if there is a dominant supplier, or if there are only 2 or 3 dominant suppliers, supply risk is high. It would depend on the technological sophistication. If it's highly technologically sophisticated, so glue would fall in low pro. Yes, correct. Right? So technological sophistication might lead to supply risk, right? Number 3, capacity crunch might move items into high supply risk. So a lot of these factors create issues in terms of supply management. So we have two broad parameters: supply risk as well as profit impact, high, low, high, right? Right. I'll just give you an example. I'll just give an example, right? In fact, just give me some moment. In fact, we'll also talk about a much more complicated framework, which is called purchasing chessboard, right? So I don't know, did anybody intern with AT Kearney or not? So this is nowadays a very important tool in the AT Kearney operations consulting arsenal, right? Purchasing chessboard. So a few of their consultants brought this up. I've shared a small article on this. I'll just share this. I'll just come back to it. But allow me to sort of explain the setup first, then I'll give you some examples, right? So now the point is you have profit impact and you have supply risk, right? Profit impact and supply risk. So high, low, right? So basically, when the profit impact is high, right? And this supply risk is low. Right? Think of, for example, tires in a car, right? Tires are relatively speaking a key part, right? Key part, relatively speaking. But supply risk, I won't say it's pretty high, right? I mean, quite a few suppliers are there, right? Quite a few suppliers are there. So in that sense, right, it is possible. The prescription as an outcome of this planning matrix is to leverage your scale. So basically what you say is, I mean, you don't make 2 million more. I make 2 million of these vehicles every year. What is the best price that you can give me, right? Because see, the problem is, the reason why you would be able to exploit purchasing power, because supplier is also constrained, right? So in that sense, that's the idea of leveraging items, right? So leveraging your potential purchasing power. I'll give you yet another example, right? For example, if you go back to let's say laptops, for example, right? Laptops, for example, if you talk about, right? So now what happens is, if you try to talk about, for example, processors historically, that was potentially supply risk was high. But if you talk of some of the lesser mundane items, for example, right? For the more mundane items, if you talk of, for example, keyboards, or if you talk, for example, casings. So I mean, I'm not talking of Apple, because Apple had a very different process, but broadly casings were available, right? For example, if you're trying to go to get something which are forged, some of you might be engineers, right? Forging, if you might remember, right? Forged items, right? So forging items, forgers to are dime a dozen. Forgers are dime a dozen. I'll give you yet another example. So for example, if you are talking of, let's say, fabric suppliers, right? Fabric suppliers, dime a dozen, leverage items. So a key part of your business is fabrics, but fabric suppliers are huge. A lot of them are players. So fabrics would have an outsized impact, but because a number of such suppliers are there, you can leverage your scale once more. You can leverage one scale once more, right? Now, so I'll even possibly try to give example from each of these quadrants, so to speak, right? So let me talk of something else, right? So suppose you take this idea that high profit impact, high supply risk. Think of it as, again, the whole engine story as you're trying, right? That's why many of them have formed strategic partnerships. That's why many of the OEMs, auto OEMs, are forming strategic partnerships for supply of raw materials as well as supply of electric vehicle batteries, right? Strategic partnerships, right? So, but if you come at the other end of the spectrum, right? If you take it diagonally, this is profit impact low, supply risk low. ना तो ज्यादा फर्क पड़ने वाला है और ना तो risk है. So either way, it's all right. So the prescription as per project portfolio matrix is I think if I said that, it was a bit least basically only part. Number of suppliers, right? State of technology, capacity, right? When I say capacity, it means availability of capacity. So these 3-4 things would be very, very crucial in terms of whether the supply risk is high or not, right? So it's not just about the number of suppliers, it's also about technology, it's also about the capacity, right? And interplay of all these factors, right, would determine whether the item is high supply risk or not, right? High supply risk or not. Now, the point is, okay, for example, if we were to talk of non-critical, the most mundane of items, very routine, very non-critical, right? Very usual items will are very small part of your cost structure, and even in terms of supply availability, it's not an issue at all. So what this prescription is, simplify and automate the magical part, and I hope you realize it's a very old framework, but one of the reasons why it continues to be used is, I'll give you an example from PNG, and I'll just show it to you possibly, right? This to tickets I'll upload. This is from an article, right? An academic article which was written from about PNG's new sourcing setup, right? So possibly they might have changed it. This is just a little bit old, but I find it amazing. One of the other classes, I think one of the other sections or classes, possibly somebody talked about standees of PNG, etc. So remember, they were $8 million to $10 million worth of expenditure, right? So they are, and again, these are not, I mean, those in-store displays, these are not some really critical items, right, in terms of their technology or something. So any small scale setup will also make it for you, right? Any small scale setup. So in that sense, it's not going to be those standees, in-store displays would basically be a typical non-critical item, right? Typical non-critical item. So what PNG did was they brought on board a tool which allowed them to automate the procurement of this and items like this, just like what Kraljic predicted, suggested long time back. Right? And the amazing part of the tool is this. It allows you to bring social sustainability, environmental sustainability, everything in an automated environment. That is the beauty of this tool. Anything and everything in an automated environment can be brought up. But that's why I just love this, right? So I'll just maybe work you through detail, step by step, right? So in this tool, as you can see, there are a lot of options, right? Scenarios, reports, supplier help, assessment, etc., etc., etc. So prior rating, this, that. So what you do is you initially create a simple setup that this is the scope of what you're looking for, right? So I mean, this could be, as I said, in-store standees. So you might mention that, no, I want 6 feet by 3 feet. This should be the, this kind of steel, or this hardened plastic should be the material. Display area should be 82% of the overall area. It should be sliding non. So you can give the sorry, you can give the entirety of things, right? You can give the entirety of things. Some of these you can make optional. So for example, if you want something which can be rolled, you might be okay with non-rollable option also. But maybe because of logistics cost, you might want to give rollable, right? So you might want to say you can offer rollable option as well as you can offer non-rollable option. So a supplier, while bidding, they can, depending on their expertise, they can offer either of the two, right? And you can decide weights accordingly, right? So PNG would be able to set up this in a very nice way, very nice way, right? Pura setup kar diya. Then it would also allow you, in some cases, to pre-select based on past interaction. So for example, it is possible for you to open a contract, right, for new players, or if it is what you feel maybe something that you do not want to try, you may not want to bring on board anybody new. You can do that also. You can open it in general also, right? And in terms of setting up the auction mechanism, right, it allowed you to bring on board so many interesting features. Do you want, I mean, this is just a snapshot. By the way, in case anybody is interested in reading this article, it's a bit old, but it gives you a fairly detailed overview. It's from interfaces. If you're interested, just ping me. I can share it with you, right? So now the point is, okay, do you want to go for single sourcing, right? So that can be arranged, right? Do you want to prioritize some of the economically, socially, whatever disadvantaged groups? Is it for the entirety of the contract, or is it because of the a part of the contract? That also you can specify. That if the total volume is, let's say, 10,000 display units, 2,000 have to be awarded at least to somebody from, right? I mean, see, different places have different realities, right? If, for example, in the Indian context, a lot of it is cultural, social, economic, etc. For example, in the American context, of course, these are things that the racial component it also. So there might be an African American, you might want to prioritize them in Europe, for example, right? Or especially in America, or in England, for example, right? You might want to prioritize. When you say prioritize, there are multiple ways to prioritize, right? So anybody interested in football might have heard of Rooney rule, right? If not, find out. Right? So I'm just trying to highlight that you can prioritize in an auction. In an auction. Again, this is not being done manually. You just design it. You just design it. That's it. Run the auction. It's very transparent. Rules are defined broadly. Expectations are already set. Prioritization algorithms are already there. Run the auction, get the result. Just like Kraljik's portfolio suggested. Just like Kraljik's portfolio suggested. Right? The last one is this bottleneck items. What are these bottleneck items? Interesting things. Low profit impact, high supply risk. I would draw your attention to something which we already discussed. Remember when we were talking about who's, where, and how of inventory. I gave the example of Cisco, right? Who struggling with one of the components and trying to ensure. So remember, Cisco, but those components were generally not high-tech components, just that raw material was becoming an issue. Right? So again, it was not because of tech, it was not because of low number of suppliers, it was because of capacity crunch that these items became a high supply risk. Profit impact of the item per se was low. So the general sort of prescription would be try to ensure your supply, right? Now the problem is that how did Cisco ensure this? They went into that forward buy contracts, if you remember, right? Forward buy, asking their suppliers to buy on their behalf. So book it to me. And automatically, because suppliers' risk was reduced, they started leveraging that, bought in bulk, and supply was ensured for Cisco. Of course, we know that this story, unfortunately, does not have a happy ending, if I may use the word, right? We all know that. Right? This story does not have a very happy ending. And in that context, what happened was that, okay, all right, what they ended up doing was that when the downturn happened, right, when the tech life cycle changed, right, the items that they thought will go up did not go up, the sales did not go up. The entire inventory burden fell back on Cisco, leading to write-off more than $1 billion, right? But for a long time, this approach was working. And risks happen, right? I mean, we all know you cannot predict everything. Risk management is something we'll talk about, especially in a post-COVID world. Anyone and everyone is talking of risk management. Possibly in the second half itself, we'll talk a little bit about risk management, right? So in a sense, what I'm trying to highlight is we had different examples here, right? We talked about, for example, of engines, right? We talked about sub-assemblies, right? Small sub-assemblies. We talked about standees and display items, right? Right? We also talked about, for example, items like tires. And each of these seem to broadly play out. Right? Now, what we want to do next is to understand that, okay, P&G used technology in a big way. And it was fundamentally to drive efficiency, right, in cost, right? It also allowed them to meet institutional commitments about social and environmental aspects also, right? So the setup is amazing that way. So many times technology can be a force multiplier. And that is precisely what Metro's vision was. When they tried to adopt that RFID technology, right? That radio frequency technology, right? So that is precisely what Metro was also trying to do. But as most of you, all of you might have read the case by now. So Metro faced some issues, right? But having said that, I need to emphasize that was more than 15 years ago, right? More than 15 years ago. But having said that, what I would request everyone to look at is I'll just show you a vision of theirs. And I hope you would realize, based on last time's discussion, right, about Amazon, Go-Kart, technology being used in Alibaba, etc., much of that technology was realized by somebody else. But they had the audacity to just go ahead and experiment with that. So allow me to show the vision to you, right? But just remember, it is 15 years, more than 15 years old, right? So let's look at their vision, right? Just give me 1 second and pull it up, right? But as I said, remember, it's 15 years back. And you will see whatever we had covered last time, coming to fruition after 15 years, 10, 15 years roughly. I'm sure many of you would remember the Go, that Amazon Go card that we saw last time, right? Just look at that. And this is 15 years. Of course, Amazon's game plan was very different, right? Linking it to your Alexa shopping list and all that. But just look at see technology. There are so many routes to technology, you never know which would fructify, right? So it is what it is. We had Alexa there, right? Remember, we had Alexa in that store, right? just look at who is who of the world, right? At that point, right? Of course, many of them are now very different. Right. So see, so what I was trying to highlight was that the vision was in the works for a long, long time, but it was actually realized in a very different way. Of course, the technology also keeps on evolving. So, what did Metro do? What did they think about it? What were some of the challenges? And post that, we'll also talk a little bit about this Zara a little bit, right? We'll talk about risk and draw a line in all these discussions. So maybe let's have a break, right? 15 minutes or so. So 4:43 by my watch. So we'll be back after 15 minutes. Discuss about Metro. Discuss about Zara. Talk a little bit about risk management, and then move ahead, right? So let's have a break. Great. So we were talking of RFID at the metro, right? So see, what was the basic idea there? The basic idea there was to basically talk about the role of technology there. And as I was mentioning during the video also, the vision that Metro had, right? And Metro is as traditionally literate as they come. In fact, for those of you who are interested in ops, right, because Metro and Aldi in some senses uh, come from similar geographies, right? Might be a good idea to spend some time trying to understand the different models that they have within a similar geography, right? And it mentions it in some detail, right? Having said that, the vision that Metro had, right, 15, 20 years ago, in terms of the entire shopping process, in-store experience, flow of information, is quite remarkably similar to what has come to fruition, but in a very, very, very different setup with very different technology. What I'm trying to highlight is RFID has little to no role in the entire process, right? Little, very little, right? But a different type of technologies, a different kind of setups have come, right? Be it in terms of payment, be it in terms of information, be it in terms of replenishment, be it in terms of experience, whatever the nature of it. But the overall vision, right, was remarkably similar, right? So this is also interesting because in that sense, what they often say in innovation, that just because you're an innovator does not mean that you will extract value also. Right? So value creation and value extraction are two very, very different things. So that is why Metro was experimenting with RFID. Like all of them, they had identified the potential utility of RFID quite early, right? In fact, somehow retail as a category does not have this image of it being very tech friendly, which is not true at all, right? Bus park, your barcodes, or for example, you talk of RFIDs, or you talk of, for example, blockchains, whatever the nature of it, right? For example, the first barcode was again, for a chewing gum, by the way, for a Wrigley chewing gum, right? Again, because they wanted to track, they want to understand what is happening to their inventory, right? So all those things, questions, needed to be answered. And that is why what they were trying to understand was that, okay, what needs to be done, right? What needs to be done? So in that sense, what this and many of the other companies were also experimenting with was that if you want to leverage this, you need to understand the technology. And see, this technology has profound implications. You must have noticed, right? It has implications at procurement level. It has application at logistics level. It has implications for warehouse operations. It has implications for retail store operations. It has implications for reverse logistics also. So that is why you saw that laundry list of companies, right? You had BCG also, you had IBM also, you had SAP also, you had Metro also, you had this, that, and a lot of long, big companies, small companies being put together because of the potential transformative impact of the technology. Of course, it's a different story that much of what they felt did not really come through, right? So it was felt that this would be revolutionized, that would be revolutionized. We would do this. Of course, not much of it came through, but that's the nature of technology. It's a bet. It's a bet, right? It's a bet. But see, maybe to just dig a little bit deeper, there was a substantial upfront investment in the technology, right? Upfront investment in terms of certain the entire setup, right? Readers, right? And you could pass through them and all those things. And potentially what they were looking for, that through the use of RFID, there could be benefits in a warehouse. So for example, if you try to use it in a warehouse, right, and there's a pallet over which multiple boxes are kept, right, you don't have to go around scanning, because the moment you move the pallet under the RFID terminal, it will automatically detect that this item has passed the loading bay, or in a return it has come out of the unloading bay, right? Similarly, if you try to unload the pallet in your superstore, for example, you don't have to again keep on tagging it, right? There's yet another issue about theft, right? And because the workforce requirement comes down, there will be issues of employee headcount also. So I mean, there were a lot of implications of this technology, right? And Metro was hoping that this technology would have a huge impact on that. But the important thing to remember is, even at a technology, the moment you try to implement it, it had 3 levels of analysis. as the case tells. There was a pellet level implication, there was a case level implication, and there was an item level implication. Even in 2021, item level implication has not come through. Companies do not use RFID at an individual item level because even now they simply cannot make the system work, the process economics work. Case level, yes, depending on the product. Pellet level, most definitely, yes. Yeah, pellet level, though it's manageable, right? So my point is that item level, see, why I'm spending so much time? Because if any of these things are not workable, see, for example, you look at the role of employee requirement, right? Because you don't have to scan every box. This requires tagging at case level, right? And pallet level. That does not require tagging at item level. But if you want to control theft using RFID, right? This obviously requires item level tagging. In general, you won't find cases of theft involving cases, right? So a Pepsi case, a 2-liter case of 9 bottles, right? Or a pallet with, let's say 30, 40 of such cases. So the theft would typically at item level. But if you want to control the theft part of the equation, you have to go for item level tagging. But item level tagging, the profitability does not. Even today, 2021, it's not there. 2021, it's not there. But I hope you realize, right? That's the part where the software hardware battle beats up, right? The classic Andreessen, I don't know, Mark Andreessen's article, right? Software is eating the world. Using imaging and machine learning, the interpretation of data is very, very different as compared to the hardware. I mean, of course, there is software also of RFID also. So what was not possible in this world is being made possible in this world. Right? What was not possible in this world was being made possible in this world, right? Not through RFID, just to be clear, not through RFID. RFID at item level still does not work 15, 20 years down the line. But what I'm trying to highlight is the vision has materialized. It is a different matter altogether that the underlying technology, the technology driving the entire transformation is different. So that is why technology is a risky game. And part of the reason why Clayton Christensen has also highlighted that both revenues as well as costs are highly uncertain. The outcome is uncertain. I mean, in fact, in some senses, that's the magic of it all, right? If everything was certain, why would we call it innovation? If everything was certain, why would we call it innovation, right? So the point is, okay, this is all building towards all of this, right? So Metro, using technology, faced issues. They tried to solve. Some of it could be solved, some of it could not be solved. So as I said, maybe once you have a better understanding of after all of this discussion about fixed cost, variable cost, technology without technology and Aldi. So maybe try to compare the role of the model of an Aldi with a Metro. Also try to understand in what places the technology would succeed and in what places the technology would fail. Right. So try to do that. Let me try to move ahead, right, a little bit quickly. So I would like to introduce this very, very, very popular framework called purchasing chessboard, right? Purchasing chessboard. This is from the house of A.T. Kearney, right? So basically, how purchasing chessboard? Number one, it's called a purchasing chessboard because there are 64 moves, right? 64 moves in that. But perhaps more importantly, it gives you a framework for action. A plan of action depending on which item, which component you are dealing with. So what you see in front of you, this is from reading, which is already there in your course pack, right? In your reading material. So do read that. I'll try to brief you on that, and then we'll try to build on this. Make sense? So basically, what you do is I'll just show you so what they have done is the authors. Now here, I think the author and the primary author Michael Chu is now with BCG, right? So what they do is I'll just show it to you, right? So what they do is they essentially start by asking this simple question. What is the simple question? The simple question that they ask is, if you try to map, remember this at the different components for a company, right? So for example, you could be an FMCG, so there could be about commodities, this could be about packaging material, this could be about glue, this could be about this, that, etc., right? So across components, right? So you try to map across components the supply power and the demand, your power, right? And based on which quadrant a given component falls, and more importantly, what is the quantum of spending on that component, because you do not want to spend too much time on something which does not necessarily have a very huge profit impact, right? Broadly, not from a procurement analytics point of view, not from a risk management point of view. Risk is handled slightly differently, right? So the point is, okay, you try to map it here, and what is the outcome? So this is from a book which a companion book which they have written, which you can always go back and check it out. I'll just show you an example from their book itself, right? So the example which they have is that, for example, yeah. So what you have in front of you is 6 different companies, right? 6 different companies, and what they have done so far is that for the different heads of their spending, right? It could be something as mundane as stationery. It could be something as strategic as, for example, the semiconductor chips for controlling processes, right? Which can potentially lead to life. So depending on what you were talking about, right? This implication would be there. This implication would be there, right? And it allows you to map the process. So, and they have their own setup using which they are able to leverage all of this, right? Using which they're able to leverage all of this. And in the same context, so for example, if you see here, right, construction machinery manufacturer, right? So a lot of categories under which they do spending, right? A lot of categories under which they do spending, right? And within this setup, what they do is they try to subdivide this, right? They do, how do they subdivide? I'll just show you an example, right? So what they've done is they've blown it all up, right? They've blown it all up, right? And they have a scoring process. So just give me a second. I'll share the scoring process with you also, right? I'll just share the scoring process. So on their main website, they have shown that how do you build it all together. So I'll just share it with you so that all of us get a fair sense of. So I hope this is visible to everyone, right? So let's play it for you, right?
Welcome to A.T. Kearney's Purchasing Chessboard tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll provide an overview of the idea behind the purchasing chessboard and demonstrate how to work with the purchasing chessboard using a case example. In the last couple of decades, there have been changes in the business environment that have posed new challenges to procurement. Extreme volatility due to global events and a quest for sustainability, in addition to increasing competition, have made life difficult for procurement. These new challenges demand new approaches, as classic sourcing methods will offer limited results compared to the value we desire. To help procurement overcome these challenges, A.T. Kearney developed the Purchasing Chessboard. The Purchasing Chessboard takes a set of questions about the supply and demand situation as inputs, and helps in the identification of the most suitable purchasing methods across 64 choices. These choices aid in development of robust category sourcing strategies. The Purchasing Chessboard has 4 basic strategies, 16 levers, and 64 methods that are based on experiences and insights acquired by A.T. Kearney from thousands of engagements.
So
the 64 squares in the Purchasing Chessboard provide a rich reservoir of methods that can be applied either individually or combined to.
So basically what they do is they allow you to map it, and then after that they ask you to score it. So I'll just show you the scoring part maybe. So they have separate questions, right? So separate questions corresponding to each
players have
component,
market share split,
right? And they'll ask you to score, and based on that you can try to understand whether you are in a zone of supply power or so it's there on the A.T. Kearney website, right? Allow me to explain, how do you map this? So for example, for this this company that we saw, right, Gearbox Wala. So this is the spend which they have, number one. The size of the circle. The size of the circle is the quantum of expenditure on this part, right? So first of all, what you do is supply power, as you can see, right? I mean, maybe I'll just reduce a little bit, right? So I hope you can see the axes are the same as before, right? Demand power, supply power. Based on the questions that they ask, you try to situate your spending in a category there, and the size of the circle corresponds to the quantum of expenditure, right? And based on the location, because it's a 4, 16, 64, right? So based on where you locate yourself, you have those potential options. So for example, if you look at hydraulics, right? Now hydraulics is where demand power as well as supply power is high, right? So the prescription would be to, I mean, if you remember Kraljic, what did Kraljic say? Kraljic said, make relationships. By the way, this is spiritually not very different from Kralji's portfolio, by the way. Because I told you, right, Kralji's portfolio, even after decades, continues to have ramifications, right? Having said that, within hydraulics, the point is, okay, it is happening, right? And the revenue, what's the outcome? Revenue sharing, or you go for profit sharing. So basically, you become much more enmeshed, which is precisely what Kralji's portfolio was also saying, right? If you can't, for example, talk about something like office material, right? The most mundane of supplies, no supply power. I mean, nahi chahiye, it's useless for you. So what you do is you might as well outsource the procurement. So for example, in IM Koi code, right, a lot of the IT infra is outsourced because it's not that useful from a spend point of view. Of course, from network criticality point of view, it's very, very crucial. So you require proper monitoring and implementation. That's obviously true. So essentially, net of net, under this framework, what you do is, as if you go back to the article which I've shared, right? So I'll just refer you to that article. This article, by the way, is already there in your course pack, as I was mentioning. So just if you give me a second. So what you do, I mean, between you and me, I'm not not a big fan of this whole 64 approach, but it is what it is. So if we look at it, for example, if you are somewhere here, right? So if you are here, the option levers that are available to you are, for example, integrated operations planning, right? I'll just show you an example, right? Walmart and PNG, right? So Walmart, PNG, what is happening is that buy power is also high, supply power is also high, right? So seek joint advantages supplier would be the purchasing strategy, right? You have 16 with 4 levers, right? Top right, 4 levers would come under this domain: value chain management, value chain partnership, cost partnership, integrated operations planning. As I said, I'm not a big fan of the way they have defined it, but definitely it has a lot of utility. And within that, right, so within that respective quadrant, I hope you can see under integrated operations planning, we have VMI, which is precisely what the relationship between Walmart and PNG was, right? So you name it, it has been there. This is a very, very useful tool if you want to understand, categorize spends and manage your spending. It allows you to understand where should you do what, right? So for example, if it is the most mundane of things, right? Most mundane of things. So possibly what you want to do is you want to be able to, let's say, manage spend, right? Manage spend, you have co-sourcing, commercial data mining, etc., right? Just give me 1 second, right? I'll just. Sorry for that. When you're trying to manage multiple things, your life goes mad. Yeah. So within that, if I remember that, whole PNG and Standy story, if I remember, right? So that was fundamentally about creating contracts, leveraging data, right? So commercial data mining. So again, all of these strategies work very, very well. They work very, very well, right? It's a very popular tool. Anybody interested into procurement, I would strongly urge them to read up on this, right? It gives you a lot of prescriptions. But it's always my life philosophy. You never take things at their face value completely, right? So don't be too enamored by this 4-16-64 structure, right? You have to sell the solution also. So definitely there's that aspect also. That's true for everyone. Why should I buy my Michael Show? So Michael Show, I think, is now with Christian Show is now with BCG, if I'm not mistaken, right? So but he continues to have some involvement in this. So have a look at this if you get some time. What we want to do to going forward is to talk a little bit about integration of all of these things, right? So we'll take Zara as the placeholder, and then again come back to risk management. Right? So allow me to show you the story of Zara, fairly detailed story. I'm always amazed by that. I'm always amazed by what they have been able to achieve, right? So just give me a second, I'll pull up Zara. Fairly detailed overview.
Inditex is an international fashion retailer. At the beginning of 2002, it had 1,284 stores and 27,000 employees around the world. The company's principal operation was Zara, a chain of women's fashion stores that operated in 32 countries, including locations such as Paris, Milan, and Tokyo. Inditex's 5 other clothing chains were Massimo Dutti, Pull&Bear, Bershka, Stradivarius, and Oysho. Inditex was based in northwest Spain, near the coastal city of La Coruña. Founder Amancio Ortega opened his first Zara store here in 1970. In 2000, the company opened a new headquarters building. It also operated about 20 manufacturing and distribution facilities in the region. This case describes the structure of Inditex's sector, its key international competitors, and the company itself, with a particular focus on the Zara chain. Zara's 4-step business system, involving design, sourcing and manufacturing, distribution, and retailing, is described in detail, as is its internationalization. The case concludes with senior executives of Inditex discussing their strategy in detail at a management roundtable. The questions raised include where to focus Zara's future expansion and the chain's ability to sustain its competitive advantage, justifying the assumptions about continuing rapid, profitable growth built into its hefty stock market valuation.
One of the first things that we need in this vertical integration of the production is to have the right information. How do we get the right information? We can have all the information daily from the stores on sales the day before, but that's easy, just to know what styles are selling, what colors are selling, and all this. But the difficult thing is to know what we don't have and we should. And in order to know this, communication is very important. Personal communication with the store manager. And for instance, we are now seeing a meeting that they are having right here, all the product people along with the commercial people, in order to establish also how many styles we're going to do for the collection that they are doing right now. And they are just dealing with the information that they are getting from the store managers, and they are now putting it all together in order to take decisions about the product and how to manage the product. After all this information they get from the stores, then we have different options about the product. The creation is not only a matter of the designers, graphic designers. It's a matter of all this information and all the decisions that they all together take following all this information that they are gathering in the stores. Once we get all this information, we have several options. First of all, we can decide that an article is not selling well, so we can take it out of the collection. No problem at all, because we don't have stock. As we produce, we sell, we just send to the store, so it's not a problem of stock. Also, we can decide just to keep in style but make another one which is slightly different, because people in the stores, they ask for this. And they say, for instance, don't you have this in this color? Don't you have stripes instead of squares? And then another third option that we have is to introduce a new item in the collection. And that's very important, because actually that's the main objective of Zara. All the integration, all the organization, all the work that we do and how we do it is in order to get this fast response to the market when they need it and how they need it. Since this is like a chain with no end and no beginning, you know, it's like everything just goes around. So this will be the beginning, but at the same time is the continuity, because this happens during the whole season.
No, es que me faltó, le dijo a Begoña, me faltó este producto y este y este y este. Dice, mira, ese producto entró, tuvo su momento y se quemó. Se quemó. Hay una señora de una camisa y que pedían
Once the decisions have been taken, then we find all the people that we see behind me, which are all the designers, the graphic designers, and they are the ones who make all the trends that they are supposed to come for the next season. Also, all those necessities, all those needs that the public and the clients are asking during the season as well. The designers, they're really close to the people who are doing all the samples for the garments that we are going to manufacture ourselves in our facilities, in our plants. all these garments that you see hanging all over are the samples that they are studying, that they are seeing whether they're going to stay like this or we're going to make any change. We have like 200 people in the creation team, and we are talking about the three departments: menswear, children's wear, and women's wear. They are all working on the same way. They are all organized on the same way. From everything that you can find in the store, 80 to 90%, depending on the collections, of course, but 80 to 90% is more or less is produced in Europe. From that 80 to 90%, we have like a 60, 65%, which is manufactured here in Spain. And from that, 50% is made right here in Artejo, here in our facilities. Our fabrics arrive here from several parts in the world, mainly from Italy, France, and even Spain. Once we have the fabrics, we have the first step, which is the marking, which will help us to take the most profit, to minimize the waste of the cloth as we are going to cut. As we cut more than 35 million meters of cloth in 1 year, this is a very important step to take. It's like putting a puzzle, but it's a puzzle where the pieces don't match, because actually the patterns are different, they have different shapes. So the persons in charge of doing the marking, they must make this puzzle fit, although they are not supposed to match. This is one of the most difficult things, because it becomes even more difficult as they have to match stripes, or they have to respect the direction of the cloth. This information goes straight to the cutting table. The matches will be from 40 up to 100, 120 layers of cloth. We pick up the blocks of fabric which are sent to the workshops. In the workshops, they put together all the pieces of the garments. These workshops are located all over the region in Galicia, even the northern part of Portugal. The workshops are owned by independent subcontractors. In total, we have more than 11,000 people working in the workshops. The workshop is organized as an array of small assembly lines. Garments are sent back here to the very same manufacturing plant that has done the cut. Once we get them back here, we start with the quality control, which also is the beginning of the ironing process. Quality control involves several steps. We check every single part one by one. Once we finish the quality control, then the garments are sent to the bagging system machine. They are bagged and transferred to the distribution center on an automated system. This system links every manufacturing plant with the logistics center by a total of 211 kilometers of rail. The distribution center has an area of 400,000 square meters, which are divided in two areas. One of it will be dedicated to the hanging clothes, and then another one to the folding clothes. These two floors for the hanging clothes, the first one is where we receive all the garments which are arriving directly from the manufacturing centers. And the second floor, where we can see the red papers, this is the floor where we distribute the garments to the stores. Actually, in those red papers, we have the names of each store in the world. Then in the other area for the folding garments, the way we distribute is using what we call the carousel, a distribution machine which has been done specifically for us. A system of distribution based on the mail. As the garments arrive to the computers, they pass through the infrared for the barcode. So they identify what kind of garment we're going to distribute at that moment. The folding clothes are carried around the carousel on trays, which automatically distribute into boxes that are going to the stores that order them. The way the stores make the orders is through the PDA. The day that they have to make the order, they just connect the PDA, and the office here in the logistics center will send them all the availability that we have in the logistics center, everything that we have manufactured from the last order. By the end of the day, they just gather all the orders from the 3 departments inside of the store in one of the PDAs, and they connect it again, so the order will arrive to the office here in the logistics center as a unique order from that store. The trucks are owned by independent subcontractors. The stores order twice per week, although we send the merchandise 4 times per week from the distribution center here in La Coruña. 2 days we'll distribute to a specific geographical area, and then another 2 days will be for another geographical area.
Right, so I must have seen this at least 50 times, but at least every time I watch it, right, it's just so amazing, right? Because see, the sheer focus on the ability to innovate in operations is just astounding, right? See, you must have seen small things, right? For example, the way the ironing process was carried out. Just to save some time, right? You don't have to be very careful while placing, very careful. Just leave it there, right? Do it automatically. The clothing, much of the clothing, for example, was ready for display. Not unlike, for example, what Aldi was doing. Remember, these two are very different industries. So Aldi, when it's ready to display items, is not very different from what Zara is trying to do. Ready to display items. Again, we focus on speed. And then coming back to the rest part, right? So Zara does something interesting. See, obviously fashion, right? So in fashion, I mean, there are surprises in the most usual of categories. So fashion, by definition, it's something which is a bit tricky, right? So in fashion, there would always be risk of oversupply, undersupply, the usual risks, etc., etc. So one of the ways to manage, if you remember, especially in the context of the sports supermarket case, capacity was a big question. Now see, Zara is primarily a major part of its operations are based in Spain. The so-called La Coruña region, right? Followers of football might remember Deportivo La Coruña region, right? The Spanish club, the last outside the big three to sort of have made a major mark, right, in the league. Now, so the point is what Zara has, given the nature of the product, right, given that, because the product is unique in the sense that not a lot of economies of scale are there in apparel manufacturing, right? The final part, not fabric manufacturing, right? So what they have is they have a tie-up with lot of small players in Spain, Portugal, as well as Turkey, right? So what they do is the moment demand goes up, right? They subcontract to all of these players. And remember, these are much smaller players. So in that sense, the supply power is quite low. Supply power is quite low. And by breaking the order into multiple such small components, the risk is also spread out. You are not becoming dependent on anyone, right? So that is why they are able to leverage that scale. And the beauty of it is, right, we have talked information, right? You must have seen the way information was being collected. Amazing. Absolutely amazing, right? I mean, you have real-time access to, I mean, almost as close real-time access to data as possible. Not only what people are buying, not only what is stock, what is when there is stock out, but also because when people come somewhere and they ask for a different variant, even that data is captured, right? So you want a gray shirt in the same design, but it's not there. So that's, and because you have a very compressed supply chain, very responsive supply chain, you're able to respond to that demand very quickly, right? So again, these are some very interesting choices which a company like Zara has made. Can everyone do this? Obviously not. Not should you try to copy, right? Because see, everybody is trying to compete in a very different sense, right? Rahul, you have a point, right? Please go ahead.
Sir, if they're actually having a contractor, so how can they actually ensure that their supply chain is very responsive? Because you are dependent on other person also for your supply.
Right. I think it's a very good point. So see, in the overall context of Zara, right, theirs is a very, relatively speaking, very integrated supply chain. So why this is an important part is, see, in many of the other players, right, many of the other players, what they would do is they might have fashion houses in Italy, right? Fashion houses in, let's say, UK, in London, fashion houses in, let's say, in America. What they will do is they focus primarily on design. Then a lot of the production logistics is outsourced, right? So sourcing is outsourced. So design comes to, procurement happens, then production happens, then logistics happen. Zatme, a lot of it is internal, including design, right? So what happens is, by virtue of those contractors, what they do is, it's not as if the chain becomes extra elongated. What simply happens is, demand reaches there, right? For example, whatever shirt I'm wearing, they want the gray option or a green option for that. So designers design that, because see, this from store directly, this information is available, right? And remember, designers are sitting, you must have seen that room, right? That's another of those peculiarities that Zara has. Production people, sales people, designer people, all of them sitting in the same room. In the room, so you don't even need to have a meeting. Somebody will just, can just walk across to someone and say, hey, will this work in this fabric? Yes, no, decision made, move forward. So in fact, that's one of the peculiarities of Zara. In fact, so much so that typically speaking, they hire young people for designers. See, if you talk of any of the other ones, right? So for example, one of the most richest people in the world, Louis Vuitton and Bernard Arnault and the others from France, right? They typically, much of the fashion world, worships at the altar of some great designers, right? But Zara does not have that. They are fast fashion. In some sense, it's being a fast follower, kind of what you like to do in the tech world, right? So in that sense, what Zara would do is, by the information is already available, design is finalized, order is released, and remember, procurement also you don't have to wait, right? Because procurement is also internal. So sab kuch hai, right? Item comes, make it, send it back. Anyway, I'm shipping again and again and again. So in that sense, the supply chain does not get elongated. Anybody else who will subcontract, remember, subcontract, identify, lay down the specs, right? Check the raw materials, right? Production, final testing. No, but they already in some senses have pre-qualified many of these smaller scale players. So they know that men's this, women's this, where all you have to go, right? So this design, who does it best, etc. They already have this, map it there, right? And you know them in advance, let them know in advance, right? And in that sense, the process is sped up very frequently. It's very different from how a normal subcontracting would work, from the way of a normal subcontracting. So that is the reason they are able to speed it up very quickly, very quickly. I mean, imagine, right? from 6 to 9 months, which is generally touted as the value for pretty much everybody else in the world, a company talking of 50 to 20 days, end to end. I mean, it's not even, if you try to draw it in a map, right, you might have to go for logarithmic scales, it seems, right, if you want to present the data properly. So nothing could be more amazing than that, right? Nothing could be more amazing than that. So in that sense, Zara is able to leverage this integrated. See, again, it's not for everyone. Hyundai, for example, one argument which some analysts is giving are giving is that Hyundai has one of the more integrated supply chains in the auto space. Is it good, bad? The answer is always it depends, right? If they're able to manage good, why are they able to manage? Because of historical reasons, because of the chaebol structure, because of Toyota does not have that much of an integration, but they have a different setup. What they would do is they would have equity ownership in a lot of suppliers, right? And they work on a very different model altogether. So if you try to sort of superimpose a model on the other, right, it is always going to back. But by the way, for those of you interested in suppliers, mergers and acquisitions, a potential game-changing deal closed, I think just a couple of days back, right? In the auto space, might be good to check it out. A potential game-changing. I mean, it was a question of survival of two of the biggest mid-sized players, but combined, they are now the third largest grouping in the world, right? And they've changed the name. I forgot what the name they have changed to. I'm very bad at remembering names, right? But a potential game changer, right? Because see, and this, what people are predicting is this is going to happen more and more. Because procurement is becoming an issue, technological life cycles are changing, as well as the underlying technology is also changing, right? So let me talk a little bit briefly about supply chain risk management. In your handout, you will find a lot of articles, each of them trying to push for a different framework. I just want to focus on one of the frameworks, which is given by Simchi Levy. And the reason is because, especially post-COVID, right, that framework is getting a lot of attention, So, and this is in the overall umbrella of conducting stress tests in the supply chain. Right? So the framework is not necessarily new, but sometimes it happens, right? Even old idea gets repackaged, repurposed whenever crisis hits. So something similar is happening world over. Players like Accenture, for example, right? They have tied up with the Simchi Levy group for conducting research, implementing in real life. So Simchi Levy, in this very, very famous article, right? What he tried was he tried to understand. Right, so this is the quantum of money spent on a supplier. So in respect to the purchasing chessboard, think of these as the size of the circles that we talked about, right? What they also did was, a basic stress test. Now, what is the stress test? So what you do is you try to map your supply chain, right? So supplier, T1, T2, T3, whatever, right? And what you do is you do a hypothetical stress test in the sense that imagine that the underlying supply from that supplier, right? In the sense that it is, for example, supplier, whatever it is. So imagine their supply gets disrupted in the process that you are able to bring the supply back, right? What is the financial impact of a disruption? So stress test. By the way, they do it in macroeconomics also, right? For banking. Stress testing, right? I mean, they have different set of parameters, by the way. But here what you do is, again, because it is becoming very, very popular in a post-COVID world, right? Stress test. Map the supply chain. It kind of, for that particular node, for that particular player, switch off. To bring the supply, not necessarily the supplier, bring the supply back on a stream, you would require some time, right? In the interim period, your supply chain may suffer. So that is used to capture the financial impact of disruption. And that is where the real insight from this framework came. When they did this analysis for Ford, and Ford has a fairly sophisticated operation, they found something very, very interesting. The quantum of money spent with a supplier has almost no correlation with the financial impact of disruption. Let me repeat the statement. See, of course, I don't want to belittle the spend. This is very, very useful from procurement analytics, spend analytics point of view. Where is spending? Why is spending? How do you leverage? Whether you want to use Kralzik, whether you want to outsource, whether you want to use purchasing chessboard, whatever. Important. But from a risk point of view, something interesting was found that in the case of Ford, for example, the amount of money spent with the supplier, right, had hardly any correlation. Automated more appropriately, very, very, very weakly correlated with the associated financial impact of a disruption for that supplier. And see, interesting things happen. Why so? Frequently, in order to manage risks, one of the fundas that gets given is you may not be want to diversify your supply. I'm sure many of you would have read about this, right? In newspapers, general publications. Sorry. Right? So what you do is, okay, you diversify, right? So for a particular component, a company B goes for supplier, 2 suppliers, right? So generally the thumb rule is, one is more, depending on where, if you are doing global sourcing, the thumb rule is 2/3 with the more efficient one. Again, this is just a thumb rule, and 1/3 with the more responsive one. This is just a thumb rule, right? Not a law or anything, right? But imagine you came to find out, oh my God, for the components, both of them are doing single sourcing from the same supplier. So technically, at the tier 1 level, you have diversified your risk, but at T2 level, nothing has happened. So this supplier becomes very, very crucial for your supply chain. And if you flick off a switch here, the entire supply chain has to be in the repercussion of that, right? And the problem is many times smaller suppliers, many times lower tier suppliers get misrepresented, get underrepresented. I'll tell you, Aston Martin, right? For a long time, James Bond Association and other things, right? Aston Martin found out to their own detriment that at one point of time, they had to stop, stop production because one of their tier 2 suppliers had supplied a substandard item for brake pedal, not even the braking mechanism, brake pedal. And the entire production had to stop. So I'm trying to highlight is spending is not a very, very good indicator of risk. Expenditure does not mean risk. Expenditure is for optimization. Risk is different thing altogether. Risk is managed differently, right? So that is with the center insight. So, and this stress testing mechanism is being used, is being talked about a lot in the industry right now, right? Again, it's not a new framework. I think it's 2014 or 16 paper, right? HBR. By the way, these articles which I'm referring, right? Please do read them. All of them are practitioner articles, right? These are not academic articles, right? So do read that. But the point which Simchi Levy was making was, okay, how do you do that? So basically, you ask a series of questions, right? It's about supplier. It's about your engagement with the supplier, right? Your product vis-a-vis the involvement of that supplier, alternatives, right? And then the hypothetical stress test. And correspondingly, what is the financial outcome? And net of net, what all happens at their suppliers, right? So for example, you will ask questions about alternate vendors. This is becoming a big area, right? Financial stability of suppliers, right? Performance variability, right? Supplier single sourcing, not your single sourcing, which I just explained, right? So all these questions get mapped, right? And based on that, you create what is sometimes called a risk exposure index, REI, risk exposure index. So net of net, what happens is that you map your entire supply chain, right? Map your entire supply chain. And from engineering, some of you might remember, right? It depends. For example, I was a mechanical engineer, and depending on which courses do you take, right? There was something called no. Remember, the problem was, see, a very good question, right? So somebody asked that why was this happening for food? Very interesting question. See, issue is, for example, if you look at automotive, right? A significant part of your expenditure could be about the metals involved, right? Very, very significant part, right? I mean, sometimes nowadays companies are trying to increase the usage of aluminum also, but even with that, now metals is not necessarily something which is difficult to procure. I mean, it's a big spending head. So you might want to optimize on design, right? You might want to leverage volume, etc., etc. But having said that, it's not as if, again, commodities, metals, many of them have cycles, but broadly, it is not very difficult. It is not very difficult. But just if you remember, in the case of, for example, sports supermare, one of the most critical elements from a risk management point of view was the zipper, which if you were to look at the bill of material for the product could possibly be the lowest cost item. Because supply come hai. Fabric, multiple players. Zippers, not so much. So that is why in the case of Ford, what they found was, okay, this is something interesting. Because price and risk, I mean, if you were to ask me, even when I did not read the article, I would have said, okay, this is a fairly significant point. Again, it is a significant point if you want to optimize your procurement process, right? True. But from a risk point of view, this is quite insightful, right? Because much of the where you spend a lot of money, generally, because the opportunity is much larger, options are also limited, though not always. I mean, for example, if you look here, right, high expenditure as well as high financial impact. So, for example, if you are dealing with a player like Bosch, so in some cases, Bosch could be the only option. So, in that sense, if their facility were to shut down, this would create havoc, and this could be an example of a company for which the expense is also more and the risk impact is also more, right? But for a significant proportion of your supply chain, expenditure and risk, not really a very significant correlation at all. Not really a very significant correlation at all, right? So that is why that is the central insight, that don't become, if you're trying to map risk, don't become overly focused on the expenditure alone, was the central insight which Simchi Levy generated in this paper, right? So now the point was, okay, risk exposure index. Fundamentally, in this stress test, you try to talk of something called time to recover or recovery, right? This is not very different from reliability, design, and all those things, right? MTTR, right? Mean time to recovery and all those. Many of you might have read about it in engineering, right? By the way, Simchi Levy also has an engineering background, so he, in some senses, might have borrowed the concept from there. So again, you try to understand the time to recovery, right? So time to recovery, which would have a financial impact, right? Depending on that, you try to map the impact. And once you have mapped this entire supply chain, right? Once you have mapped in entire supply chain, what you do is you have scores. I mean, just like, so not very different from example, the way you would score in a purchasing chessboard also, right? Just to be able to do that. So you create scores asking all those questions that I was just talking about, right? Ask them all those questions. And then if you want to manage, high risk exposure and high performance impact become very, very crucial, right? From a risk management point of view. Low performance impact, profitability impact, but high risk exposure, right? Again, you have to understand. So it allows you to understand where all should you focus your efforts on, right? And time to recovery could be crucial. See, again, a lot of interesting things can be done. Just because you are sourcing from a single supplier, that may not necessarily be a problem in itself. How can you break it down? The same single supplier might actually have multiple facilities. So as part of your risk mitigation strategy, because you have identified that this is where my risk exposure is very high, you want to mandate that my supply should be 60-40. I mean, see, what I'm trying to highlight is what is the point of, risk is something that you anticipate. When something bad happens, you be prepared for that. Right? But in terms of planning, it is done differently, right? So you already have a playbook. This is a supplier which is tricky, right? Either I start developing another supplier, right? Or even for the same supplier, you can always insist to diversify your supply basis, right? Right? And if it is becoming difficult, sometimes you even have to go back to product design also, by the way. Sometimes you have to go back to even product design also. That, okay, I'm not able to crack that market, it's very risky. Let me go back to product design. And in the next generation of products, I try to do things differently, right? So risk exposure index is created. You try to understand risk. You try to map financial impacts, spends, create this visibility into the supply chain. This is a risk-based visibility, not order-based visibility. Risk visibility, that where all risk is high, exposure is high, financial impact is all very high. This is very, very crucial to manage. And then you set up devising plans for each of them depending on what you are talking about, right? So I would strongly urge all of you to maybe spend some time with this. The article is already there with you. See, much of what we are talking, I'm not talking anything new. In fact, for the last 2-3 sessions, I'm not talking anything new. I mean, you can, but again, the course is designed like that. The point is now we are trying to integrate everything. Right? So, for example, in risk mitigation, pooling plays a very important role. Right? Pooling plays a very important role. So, should you centralize or decentralize? So, in that sense, much of what we are doing right now is an integration of the concepts that we covered in the first 3-4 modules, right? Logistics, inventory, bullwhip, etc., etc., etc. We are trying to cover that. If you look at the course pack, there are 2-3 cases, right? There is one case on, for example, BK horizontal collaboration case. So just read that. That's way too advanced for our level, but it's an illustration of how do you collaborate horizontally, right? So imagine Amazon and a Flipkart collaborating, right? An Amazon and a Flipkart collaborating. Can it happen? Yes, why not? Right? If many of the public sector banks can come together and offer a service across banks, by the way, in which money is delivered to your home, why not? Utilization, right? If both of them combine together, if logistics no longer is a differentiator, right? You might as well have white label logistics. Integrated player, who can do anything what they want. So that is for BK Tech horizontal collaboration. The next case which we will take up in the next session is basically linked to green supply chain management. It is called DHL. What's the exact name? Supply chain, DHL supply chain, right? So we'll take it as an in-class exercise. There will be a submission, group-based submission around that as an in-class exercise. So basically, we'll try to talk about reverse logistics, right? How do you design reverse systems? What are some of the challenges that you face? What happens to postponement in reverse logistics? We'll talk about that. We will also talk about green supply chain, right? So how do you model it? In some senses, we'll again design a supply chain, what we did in the first session, but now we'll also talk about sustainability parameters also, right? And we'll see what is the linkage between the economic and the environmental aspect, and why what if analysis becomes all the more crucial in multi-objective optimization. Post that, we will submit it, close the case, move ahead, right? So quiz 2 might happen tomorrow, day after tomorrow, then whenever PGP office gets a slot, right? But all of you already know syllabus, entire inventory management, entire sports over mentioning the last portion, right? Let scientific glass. Quiz 3, supply chain integration, supply chain contracts, all of it, right? That will happen sometime late. That I also still don't know. I mean, I'm not even communicated with the PGP office, right? I was just waiting for quiz 2. And that is pretty much it. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take. Otherwise, we can call it a day and meet on Wednesday then, right? Great. So if no questions, let's move ahead. Thanks a lot, everyone. We'll meet on Wednesday. Have a good day ahead. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.